If you look at the history, if you look at the present, if you look at the future, Israel's survival really dependent on having a Palestinian state that will be side by side living by Israel.
This is Faith Complex, a dialogue about the entanglement of religion, politics and art.
Hello, my name is Jacques Berliner-Blau of Georgetown University, and you're watching Faith Complex. Joining us today is Ms. Nadia Bilbassy Charters. She is Senior U.S. Correspondent for the Middle East Broadcasting Center. She also has the distinction of being the only Arab journalist to have interviewed President George W. Bush no less than 4 times. Ms. Bilbassy Charters, welcome to Faith Complex.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, President Obama has made many overtures to the Arab Muslim world, most famously his speech recently in Cairo. How was that initially received in the Arab Muslim world?
Very well. Actually, I was with him in Cairo University. I accompanied him on that trip. The fact that he decided to speak directly to the Muslim world from a capital like Cairo, to talk about opening a new page in Americans' relationship with the Muslim and the Arab world, it has a tremendous effect. The language that he used, he talks of respect, he talks about cooperation, not dictating a policy from the top, but actually dealing with each other on an equal terms. He talks about the great contribution that Muslims did to civilization in general. He talks also about foreign policy, and people wanted to hear from him how he's going to change the previous administration. Now, himself is a success story because people are very fascinated by his own narrative. To think of President Obama as somebody whose father came as an immigrant to the States, and he rose through the ranks to become a candidate for a president of the superpower in the world, that itself talks volume about America, that anybody can succeed here. So he appeals so much to the Arab world. He looks like us, as I say. He can look like half of the people in the Middle East. And his name was appealing, you know, Barack Hussein Obama, obviously. The only problem is the policies, and I think people start to separate between his own personal narrative and the policies. And if he does not deliver.
Let's talk about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. It seems that the United States has been at this now for half a century, and I'm not quite sure how much good it's yielding. What is America's realistic role or contribution to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process?
It's a big role, and you can't do without it. If you ask both parties, they will say the United States participation is a must. Although, if you ask Palestinians, they think that the previous administration has always been taken an Israeli point of view, and they have been seen as pro-Israel. But saying that, they think America is the only power that can have leverage on both sides. The European Unions have been fairly objective, but they don't have that power that America has. So, despite all the failures, and we came closer during the Clinton administration, the previous administration, President Bush, left it too late, I think, although genuinely he accepted the fact that the Palestinians have to have a state, and Israel has to have security, so the only way to move forward is a 2-state solution. Unfortunately, for the time being, there is a good intention on this administration, but you have the wrong parties on the ground. So you have an Israeli government that it is right-wing in its orientation. They don't see the bigger pictures, although some will say that right-wing governments actually the one who managed to do the peace process, like, you know, with Begin and Sadat at the time, and even Sharon, you know, Ariel Sharon, who thought the ultimate survival of Israel will depend on having a Palestinian state, because the demography is not on their side. So you have 2 options. Either you annex the rest of the West Bank and Gaza, and you have 3 million people living with no rights whatsoever in Israel proper, but then you're not a democracy. Or, you know, you can allow people to vote and have their rights, but then it's not Jewish. So they have to choose between the 2. So this is why people argue that it's actually in Israel's interest to have a Palestinian state. The only problem is you don't have leaders with a vision to think now that ultimately the only way they can do it is to sit down and to negotiate.
To what degree does Hamas's apparently Islamist ideology interfere with its ability to speak to its more secular brother in the Palestinian Authority, or is that not an issue?
It is an issue. I mean, look, all the Arab societies are conservative societies, so they implement Islamic law regardless. The Palestinian elections were the most transparent election in the Middle East. They won fairly. And then the problem is with democracy, and the hypocrisy with Western countries is when you have the party that you don't like winning, you immediately undermine them and you don't accept the results. Hamas won is because there was a gap. And when a state fails, any party can fill in, and they're providing services for the people.
Islamist movements fill the gap.
And they've been very clever in that.
Same situation in Algeria, by the way.
Absolutely, in Algeria, in Lebanon, you know, in Egypt, and everywhere. They're very good in the social in networking among the poorest of the poor and providing services.
Do they have a coherent governing vision, these Islamist parties?
No, they don't. I mean, I'm talking from personal point of view. I don't think they have a vision to the country, which direction they will take it, apart from just making it an Islamic state. I mean, unfortunately now you have a division between the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank was much more open traditionally. Historically, they have ties with Jordan. They have a closer proximity to Jerusalem, where you see tourists coming from everywhere. Gaza is very close, and the majority of people, 70%, are refugees. So they were not really under any influence from the outside world. People in the West Bank used to come to the States. They see what life is like here. They go back with new ideas. So there is no exchange of ideas in Gaza. Now, on top of that, when you have an Islamist ruling party, they're trying to impose their vision on the population, it makes the situation worse. But I think it's all political. I don't think people voted for Hamas because they believe in the Sharia law, they believe in the vision. It's because at one stage the PLO was corrupt, and I think Prime Minister Fayyad is doing a good job now building the infrastructure of a state, and they really unifying the security forces, and they were doing very well in the West Bank. But now the division is just, we're talking almost about three-state solution. Ultimately, any national movement cannot win anything. We have seen it all over, from South Africa to Algeria to everywhere. It has to be unified. So if the Palestinians want to have a state, they have to unify. And Hamas and Fatah has to share power. And they have an election, and I'm sure if they have an election, I don't think Hamas will do well.
As regards the peace process, and you're a person that travels all over the world, speaks to world leaders, if you could explain something to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, something that you feel he doesn't quite understand about the situation, what would it be?
Israel's survival is dependent on the establishment of a Palestinian state. And I don't want to give it from a moral point of view. I don't want him to think of a political point of view. But honestly, I mean, enough of the rhetoric that we hear all the time. But if you look at the history, if you look at the present, if you look at the future, Israel's survival really dependent on having a Palestinian state that will be side by side living by Israel. And ultimately, you can have nothing to stop these two states from having a federation or confederation.
The final question I want to ask you is this. We do get a relentlessly negative drumbeat of information about the Arab world. Some of it, I regret to say, justified. Tell us about something which is actually a very positive development in the Arab world today, which gives you a sense that the future is brighter than some analysts might lead us to believe.
I mean, if you look at the statistics, it's really a grim picture, and it hurts me to know that the 70 million people are illiterate in the Arab world. They cannot read, cannot write. If you look at the last UNDP report, again, we are behind Africa and Asia and everywhere else in terms of development. But I think there is a sense of purpose now, and especially among the young people, because you have to count on the young people as much as we've seen it here in the United States, and to a large extent they're the one behind the Obama revolution, if you want. I think the young people are the hope for the future. And although, unfortunately, for the time being, the choice for many people, either the dictatorship or the Islamists, it has to be a middle ground.
Nadia Bilbassy, Charters, has been such a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.